So as I mentioned in an earlier movie, the HTML5 canvas element actually has a full vector drawing API available. And again, this is very similar to the graphics object that you have on display objects in Flash. So I have a canvas defined here at 800 by 600. And in the init function here, I'm essentially getting its 2D context object. And all of the drawing API commands are going to be put onto that context object. So what I'm first going to do is to set up some styles for my drawing. So the first thing I'm going to do is to set the stroke style. And this is obviously going to be the color of any strokes that I make in my canvas application. So I'm going to say ctx.stroke_style. And I can set that equal to a hexadecimal number. So I'm just going to put in black, which is 000000. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to set a fill style. And to do that, I set the fill style property. And I'm going to set this equal to red, which is like that. And now I've essentially set up these drawing styles on the context object. Now we can go ahead and actually draw something to the screen. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a rectangle and fill it with the fill color. And to do that, I'm going to say ctx and use the fillRect method. And to this, we pass in 4 parameters. First is the X and the Y position of where in the canvas we want to place this rectangle. And I'm just going to put it at 50 and 50. And then we pass in the width and the height, or the size of the rectangle we want to create. I'm just going to make it 200 by 200. So if I jump over to Chrome now and refresh, we can see we now have that red rectangle painted into our canvas. So now if I want to stroke that rectangle, I need to do an additional method call, which is the StrokeRect method. So I'm just going to copy and paste the fillRect and change this to stroke. That will essentially do a stroke around the rectangle at this size. So if I jump over to Chrome and refresh, we can now see a black stroke around it. Let's go ahead and increase the size of that stroke. And we can do that by setting the line width property on our context object. So ctx.linewidth is equal to, let's say, 20. And that'll be 20 pixels. Let's refresh. And now you can see we have a 20 pixel stroke around our rectangle here. So you can see that in these 2 style settings, I've actually used hexadecimal numbers. Well, we don't have to use those. We can actually use either RGB or RGBA values to set colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out this red hexadecimal number, and I'm going to replace it with an RGBA. And we do that by putting it in parentheses like this. And to this, we give 4 numbers, the red, the green, and the blue values, and then the alpha value for what we want the alpha to be on this fill. So I'm going to set it equal to 255, 255, 0, and then we'll set the alpha to 0.5. And this is essentially going to create a yellow color that is at 0.5 alpha. So if we come back and refresh, we can now see that we have that color filled. That's using this existing rect object. But what if we actually want to draw paths? So if you want to do something that's a little more complicated than just a rectangle, you're actually going to be creating a path. I'm going to get rid of these 2 function calls. Now, when we want to start drawing a path, we have to actually call the beginPath function on the context object. So ctx.beginPath. That tells the context that we're about to do some path drawing. Now, very similar to Flash, where we have move to, line to, we also have those on the context object. So I can say context.moveTo, and this moves essentially the paintbrush of where we're actually going to paint. And I'm going to move it to 75 and then 50. Now to draw a line, we can use the line_to method, and we'll draw a line to 100 and then 75. And then let's do that again. So context line_to. Now we'll draw to 125. Now that we've drawn this path, we need to actually fill it or stroke it because it's not going to have any visual representation at this point. So to do that, we can say ctx.fill. So if I save that now and jump back over to Chrome, we can see it's actually drawn a little triangle here with those two line 2 calls. So if I jump back, we can actually also stroke that. And to do that, we say ctx.stroke. And if I jump back and refresh, well, it's such a huge stroke style. So I can actually bring that down to maybe 5. And one of the things you'll notice is it hasn't actually closed this path because we've drawn 2 lines. So what I can do to close that path is to use the close path method. Now it's important that I actually call that before I actually call the fill or the stroke functions. So I'm going to say ctx.closePath, and that will close any open paths that we have. So I'm going to refresh, and now you can see that this path is actually closed. So that's drawing individual lines, but what if we wanted to draw a circle or an arc? Well, I'm going to get rid of these move to and line to method calls here. There is an actual arc method on the context as well. So I can say ctx.arc. And again, to this, we're going to pass in the X and the Y position of where we want to draw this. And this is going to be the center of the arc or the circle. I'm just going to put it at 200, 200. So that's an X and a Y of 200. So the next property is the radius for how wide of an arc we want to draw. I'm just going to pass in 50 for that. And then the next 2 properties are the start angle and end angle for what we want to draw. So I'm going to start it at 0. Now for the angle here, we can't pass in degrees. So if we want to draw, let's say, a full circle, we can't say 360 degrees because it expects that number in radians. And again, if you've done Flash before, you know all about this. And to draw a perfect circle, we essentially want to pass in math.pi times 2, which is actually the size of a full circle. So if I go back now and refresh, we can see we've drawn a perfect circle. And let's say I drop the times 2 here and go back. We can see it's drawn a half circle. If you want to draw either arcs or circles, using the arc method is a very easy way to do that. An arc is great if you want to draw kind of a perfect circular type of shape. If you want to draw more of a free-form curve, you're going to want to use a Bezier curve. So I'm going to get rid of this arc here. And the first thing I'm going to do is to move the paintbrush essentially to 0 and then 300. So that's going to be 0 on the x-axis and 300 on the y-axis. Now there's 2 methods that we can use to draw Bezier curves. First is the quadratic curve to, and this essentially is where you give it an x and y, and then you give it a control point. So it has a single control point. So I'm going to say ctx.quadratic curve to, and again, we pass in first the x and the y of where one of the points is going to be, because we already have our first point. That's where we call the move to function, which put us at 0 and 300. The first thing we pass into the quadratic curve to function is where we want our control point to be. And I'm just going to put that at the origin at 0, 0. Now the next thing is where we want the final point to be, and we're going to put that at 300 and 0. And you'll see what that is like when we get over to Chrome and refresh. My first point where I called the move to function put us down here. The control point for the curve is actually at the origin, and then my final closing point is up here. So you can see this is a nice way to draw curves when you only need a single control point. If you want to have 2 control points, you can use the Bezier curve to method. And to this, we actually pass in 2 control points. So let's say I have 0, 0, and then let's say I pass in, we'll just make a crazy curve here, 500, and then we'll pass in our final point to be, let's say, 25 and 50. Let's refresh. So now you can see we have more of a free-form curve because, again, there's now 2 control points that are actually controlling this curve. And this is pretty similar to some of the functionality you have in the ActionScript drawing API, but essentially you can use quadratic curve to if you want to draw a simple curve with only a single control point. If you need 2 control points, then you would use the Bezier curve to method. But that's the basic overview of some of the drawing API features that you have. And again, if you've come from an ActionScript background and you're used to drawing using the Flash drawing API, it's not going to take you any time at all to get used to doing those same things here in the HTML5 canvas.